stuff to work, so maybe they actually did.
I know. All right, we're recording. No profanity. All right, so we're gonna actually do something kind of cool today. I'm expecting. I've never done it before. So we're gonna start. Everybody, take out your wallets. We're gonna take bets. Do you think I can do the splits across these two tables?
I'm not taking you to the
I got a piece of gum.
All right, so if you remember correctly from last time, we got this thing up here. We finished representing our roles in Puppet PM with as strings, right? Because we couldn't actually store role objects. So for a role, we're storing two pieces of information, a name and a description. And right now, it persists between runs of the application because we're storing that array of strings, which holds our individual roles. Oh, by the way, that's my brother in the back, in case you're wondering who this stranger is. Where did this kid come from? So we are actually storing an NS mutable array of strings, where a string, where each string is a Dane string delimited? Isn't that what we called it? Yeah, you betcha. Yeah, this. Here's a Dane string. So this is what separates the name of the role will come before that, and the this is the winky face. Yeah. All right, and then the description will come after that. So that's how we're storing it. Now, no harm, no foul. As you saw, it did pop up. It remembered the stuff before. If we add a third role, and that's German, by the way, then we kill it, run it again. You'll see that we still have 3 roles in there. So it's remembering crap between runs of the app. Cool, right? Okay, well now what happened is our application just got destroyed. Got a new phone. We went out, bought the brand new iPhone 5C. Baker upgraded to a 5C or 5S? 5S. Oh, okay. Well, I thought you were going to say Baker was being stupid and upgraded to a 5C.
No, that's a shock.
So that's when you get a samurai sword to the shin.
Also, so you can't even say upgrade to the 5C because it's not an upgrade.
What's this?
You can't even say upgraded to the 5C.
I know.
Also, Baker's laptop had apparently, so yeah, I think I found a program that I can do scheme on my phone. I was like, oh my god.
I know, it's so good.
You had it?
I've used it before.
Really?
There's a couple of different programs that are scheme interpreters. I mean, scheme is such a simplistic language. Why wouldn't you be able to do it on your phone? Dave's just crying. Oh, by the way, how many of you have seen the promo video for Rai, Son of Rome, the Xbox One? Doesn't that look ridiculous?
Yeah.
How many of you saw the movie 300? You know, okay, so you know how like the stop action, like gore stuff, where like, you know, they take the swords and stab it through people's faces and stuff like that? Imagine that, but in a game.
I thought it was a movie at first.
As gameplay. Isn't that ridiculous? I'm just going to always be doing the special move where you take your sword and stab it in the back of their neck and have it come out the front, and then you pull to the side so you know you got to get your sword back under your own control. Can't have it stuck in somebody's neck.
It's like swinging it around the body.
I know. So excited. Okay. So anyways, now that we've segued from the correct way to get a short sword out of somebody's neck. Okay, so anyways, let's say you upgrade your phone. You have all this project management crap inside of your application, but now you want to restore your phone. You know, download the app again from the App Store. Like, oh, I got to get all my crap back in there. Probably not the way we want it to work. So we're going to need to move to some sort of cloud storage solution. So let's come here and let's draw some pictures for Dane first. It's like popcorn. Okay, so we want to have a cloud application. So let's talk about how we would normally do this. And then I'm going to introduce you to something I was introduced to this morning. And then we'll see how it works. So we have our app. So our app lives down here, and the app's probably going to live in a couple different places, right? Hopefully more than 3 people download our app, but in our mini model, this is during the alpha testing. So we have coleslaw, Simone. Okay, so anyways, when we say we're going to store something in the cloud, what does that mean? Well, the cloud is probably going to be, let's just use a real solution as an example. So let's take GoDaddy as an example. So GoDaddy is a web hosting service. Okay, so you can go to GoDaddy, you can pay $5 a month and have their economy web hosting service or whatever. And their web hosting service is going to support, amongst other technologies, PHP. Okay, so what we're going to have also off of GoDaddy they're going to have a series of databases that we can choose from. The one we're going to use is a MySQL database. So this is where we're going to actually store our data. And this guy's a relational database. Then we're going to have a page. So we're probably going to actually have 2 separate pages. One is going to be called, let's do this, save role.php. And the other one would be called getRoles.php. Okay, so these are 2 files that we've written up here in the cloud in using proper PHP code. Both of these files know how to talk to this MySQL database. The MySQL database is where our actual roles are stored. Okay. Now, keep in mind at some point this is going to have to get more complex from the perspective of we might not, right now we don't have this concept of a project. We think that every person who's going to download Puppet PM is part of one gigantic team. So we haven't actually dropped it down to this idea that you have different companies, and each company has possibly 0 or has 1 or more teams, where each team has 1 or more project managers, and each team also has a bunch of people who are working on the team. At this point right now, we're ignoring everything, and our app is a view into a global project management scenarios worldwide. It's almost like a dictatorship. So everybody's sharing. So when Dane adds a new role on his phone, that affects every other iPhone user in the world who's also running Puppet PM. To keep this simple, okay? This is a collaborative type of situation. The whole outsourcing to India stuff, or the United States outsources to Canada. Outsource to Canada, okay. So we might write these couple of files up here. Save role PHP. That's when we create a brand new role. Okay. The way this would work is we would probably be calling a www.puppettpm.com/saverole.php. Name is equal to role 4 and description is equal to, just to keep it short, blah. Okay. well, I'll just put it right between them. So the way we would access these files, we could test it through a web browser. So we go into our web browser, we browse to www.puppetpm.com/ here's the name of our file, saveroll.php. This is assuming that our GoDaddy account is hosting this domain name, puppetpm.com. All right. We call upon our file, and our file is going to need two pieces of information in order to receive it. It's going to need a name and a description. Now, let's look at what this puppetpm think of saveroll.php as like a remote method. Okay? This comes from, let me draw another picture here. You might go to a web page and you might see something that looks something like that, right? You know, where you fill in a text box for name, fill in a text box for description, hit submit, and something happens. Okay? Now, behind the scenes, the HTML that would display this page so what did I call it? Save roll.php. Method is equal to get. Okay, so among other things, the actual HTML code that you would see inside that file would look like this. Okay, so historically, if you're writing web pages, you might create a little web page that displays a web form like this, and it would look something along these lines. That makes sense? So this is saying create a form whose action, the program that gets called as a result of this form is something called saveroll.php. And the method we're going to use is get. There's two methods you can choose to use in here, get or post. There's actually 7 different HTTP methods, but those are the two that we would most likely use. In this example, we're going to talk about get methods. Because get methods we can fake in the URL without having to create a web form. That's the convenience of it. Okay? So, we would if we were going to create a web page that gave us 2 text boxes and a submit button, it would look like this. We'd have our name and our input text box, a description, input text box, and notice we give variable names to both these guys, our name and our description, and ultimately give a submit button. So that when we click that submit button, what it does is it ultimately creates a URL like this. It will call saveroll.php, passing it a value for name and passing it a value for, actually I called it just DESC, right? Just pretend it was description. All right, so I'll pass it those two values, but the point is it builds this URL. So notice, after save role.php, there's a question mark, then there's the name of a variable, followed by an equal sign, followed by its value, followed by an ampersand, followed by the name of a variable, followed by an equal sign, followed by its value, rinse, lather, repeat if there was more than two values. This is what a GET request looks like. So you can build this URL. This is just a string in code, correct? In Objective-C, we can build this string. And if we were to then give that string to the URL, let me see if I can even give you an example. Actually, I probably... I don't have a quick example, but just take my word for it. That's the way it works. Okay? So what's going to happen is this save role.php will then get called. A PHP file is different so let's call form.html here. So let's say that the web page that is displaying this form, which we don't need in this case, just I'm kind of telling you how web servers work, is inside of a file called saveRoleForm.html. So inside of saveRoleForm.html exists this guy right here. That make sense? Among some other code. So if I were to go to that page, it's just going to display that page at the screen. But now when I go to a PHP page, that is, when I hit that submit button here, and it creates this URL and says go to saveRole.php, the fact that this guy has a .php extension says we need to do something special. These are things called MIME types. So MIME type. One MIME type would be HTML. For a web browser, which a web server would mean just serve the file. We don't need to do anything special. It's already in the format that it needs to be in. What do web servers do? They spit out HTML. That's what they do. But another MIME type might be PHP. And what's PHP need to do? Pre-process the file to produce HTML to serve. That make sense? So, and that's all up here. The GoDaddy is running a actual web server called Apache. So I'll connect this to the OS class from this morning. So as long as you're running one of their Linux-based web servers at GoDaddy, the piece of software that they're running is the popular web server called Apache. If you're using one of their Windows ones, it's running IIS, Internet Information Server. But Apache knows how to serve web pages natively. With a plugin, it knows how to pre-process PHP files, which ultimately, anything that a web server is doing ultimately will spit out HTML. Okay, will ultimately spit out something that looks along these lines, tag-based stuff. Okay? So, this is the current setup. Now, what we can do is rather than, well, this is what would happen. That web form, this guy, when we hit the submit button, behind the scenes creates a URL like this, executes it, which goes to saveRole.php. SaveRole.php then extracts the value for name, extracts the value for description, does something with them. What does it probably do? It probably writes something into that database to save it, right? And then likely spits out like the word success or okay or done, you know, or an error message, something like that. Okay? And then what would happen is we would see back out on the screen after the submit button, success. It successfully saved it. Now, what we can do, let me talk about it in these terms. How many of you have heard of something called an API? Okay, do you know what it is? Anybody who's heard of it also know what it is? Go ahead.
Isn't that like the connections that like someone gives you to hook it up, like Amazon's API, so you can connect?
Okay, so API stands for Abstract Programming Interface. That's what it stands for. Who cares, right? What is it for? Typically, APIs are communication language, communication tool for interfacing with an existing product. So, like she said, Amazon has an API. So with Amazon's API, you can interact with Amazon in some ways. There's things that they make public. So maybe you can query Amazon for a product ID or something like that. Similarly, you can there's an API for QuickBooks, which is an accounting software. You can query it for latest transactions and things like that. There's a Dropbox API. So these are things that allow you to put information in and get information out of various tools. All right. Now, API sounds complex on paper. It's just another one of these little acronyms that means something stupid. Okay. APIs are typically, I'm going to capitalize it because it looks more legit, makes it look even scarier when you capitalize it. Okay. APIs are usually implemented as something called a web service. Okay. Well, what does that mean? What is a web service? Does that also sound difficult? Possibly complex, something like that? Yeah, a web service is basically what we just created here. Is have PHP file or another dynamic file type that we can send a URL to and it dynamically processes it. That's all it means. So a web service is utilizing a web server without a web page. That's what a web service is. I think that's a pretty decent definition. I'm gonna even write that down. Using a web server without a web page. Okay? And we could actually take this a step further by speaking the HTTP protocol. Okay? That's what a web service is. Now, web services are usually implemented in one of two languages. First of all, I'll throw, how many of you have ever worked with an API before? Okay. How many of you have ever heard of SOAP? Not Simon. Okay. SOAP is a common standard for interacting with APIs. But realistically speaking, what is SOAP? SOAP is a standard that uses XML for communication. What's XML? Language used to make other languages. So XML is a data representation language, which we could have used XML last class when we were representing roles as a string, right? Instead, we decided to use Dane string separators, which work just as well, right, for us, because we were only storing 2 bits of information. But if you're storing a rich set of information, XML might work better. You know, what would the XML version of that look like? Let's go down below this. So if we were storing a role in XML, we might create a role tag. Name might be role4. Description might be blah. Script. So that might be the XML representation of a role. That makes sense? Where we represented our roles as Roll 4 separated by, I'm going to have to steal this because I didn't memorize the crazy. Separated by this. Separated by blah. And just pretend like that's all the same color. So we represented our roll like this. XML might dictate we represent a roll like that. Well, which is better?
Depends how much information you have.
Okay, well, this is the amount of information we're storing. Which of these is better? And why?
I'd say XML because it tells you what each thing is.
Okay,
For the human.
that's the catch. This one is far, 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 far better if a human being is going to be looking at it directly. We can read that a whole lot better than we can read this. I mean, first of all, you just got crazy crap in the middle, so you just think it's corrupt data. Security through obscurity, right? All right, so this is much, much better for human eyes. Now, this guy down here, though, we know how to split him using a built-in tool in Objective-C. We use components separated by string. Remember last time? Just built into the language. Like, okay, look, I know what my delimiter was. I'm just going to use that delimiter to split that guy into two pieces. Done. Well, what if I had given you a string that looked like this? There you go. That guy's now a string, and I said split that. Now we're going to have to go and look into XML parsers. What does an XML parser do? It pulls meaning out of XML represented data. Now we could write our own. I mean, this isn't rocket science necessarily, right? We could walk this guy until we hit a greater than sign. As soon as we hit a greater than sign, we know it's going to be followed by a value. Well, the value of this guy is another tag. We hit a greater than sign, we are stuck with the value for that tag, so on and so forth. So we could write a parser for this, but just to represent our data like this would be harder in our current situation, and parsing it would be a lot harder. So for us, this worked a whole lot better, right? Human beings don't need to be able to read this. We just need to be able to store it and retrieve it so our app has the old stuff in it when we reopen it. Done, right? So if you're comparing these two, our hack way of doing it is far better than the XML way, even though this way looks much more formal. All right, so XML is typically the standard for interacting with an API. The other standard is something called JSON. Okay, JSON's another language. That's the JSON version of a role. So a little bit less structured, but a whole lot less fluff. So XML has a lot of structure to it, but most of this is fluff, isn't it? Most of this is like less than, greater than signs. XML was actually born out of HTML. It's a great example of chicken or the egg. When we look at HTML and we look at XML, we say, oh, XML looks like HTML. And you could actually define HTML using XML. If you've ever seen a something, I'm just going to write it in here, it's unrelated, XHTML. Ever seen that before? That extension or something? XHTML extension is XML standard HTML. That is, let's call it perfect HTML. Well-defined HTML. For any of you who've done web pages before, most of our web browsers will accept a very bastardized version of HTML and still work. Because early days of, and actually this has led to a common problem in web development today where you have to test your web page on all the different browsers to make sure it looks right on all the different browsers. Why? In the early days of web browsers, HTML was, let's call it a loose standard. Okay, and then the people writing HTML wrote it even looser. So what happened is they had to make the web browsers work for the existing web pages to make it look right. So there's all sorts of exceptions, especially Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer has a zillion different exceptions to things like, well, that looks close to a tag I think I've seen before sometime. We'll accept it. And it just tries to make a guess as to what it is. And it's not their fault necessarily because they're one of the early web browsers that were doing it commercially. So in any case, what you have is you have a bunch of these web browsers, some of them that were written from the ground up, some of them that are based on a code base that's 20 years old now, 15 years old now, and they have all this old compatibility stuff still built into it. And each one maybe handled it a little bit differently. So our web browsers today, all a web browser is an interpreter for HTML. It receives HTML that is crap that looks kind of like this and turns it into a pretty web form that looks like this. That's what a web browser does. Okay? So the reality is that our web browsers today would prefer you give them perfect HTML. But because they've had to build on a quicksand base over the years, just because you give a web browser perfect HTML today does not mean it will render it identically to the other web browsers. Does that make sense? So that's the reason why that exists. But that idea of XHTML, that is a page that is correctly formatted HTML by the XML standard. That means probably the best example, the most common example of things where people don't use a standard. If you've ever done a web page, what does BR do? Line break, right? Okay, is that how you'd write it?
I used to like BR space backslash.
Well, not used to be. That guy right there, well here. The correct way of using the BR tag is that. That's the correct way of using BR. Every opening tag must have a closing tag. But there's nothing, you don't put anything in there. So that's a waste of time, right? The equivalent of that, shorthand for a built-in closing tag, is that. So that's a built-in opening closing tag in one. And that's XHTML compliant. But most web developers over the years just did that. Look, I want you to do a line break. I don't need to send you any data. You don't need anything. That's what does a line break, which all the web browsers support. If you do that in any web browser, it will work. So if they made an exception for that, how many other things do you think they made exceptions for? So there's your example. So this is the verbose correct way. This is syntactic sugar for the correct way. And this is just the wrong way that everybody does. It's HTML slang, if you will. All right. So in any case, here is our ghetto way of data representing a role. This is the XML version of data representing a role. And this is the JSON version of data representing a role. For the simple problem we're solving here, it really doesn't matter which of these you use. In fact, for the simple problem we're solving, this is easily the one that's easiest to work with. If you are moving a lot of data, more than two pieces of information, between one point and another point, like through an API, you might want an XML or a JSON format for your data because it consistently represents your data and can consistently represent more complex data than we're representing here. Does that make sense? Our line right here relies on the person knowing that what comes before the Dane string is the name of the role, and what comes after is the description. It relies on you having that prior knowledge. Whereas this is pretty readable by anybody, and this is pretty readable by anybody. That makes sense? So companies like Amazon or Dropbox, these companies who are making an API, they're going to write their API using a standard language. If you ever see it, call it the SOAP-based API, it'll be XML-based language. SOAP is a standard XML for APIs. But most of the new ones use JSON. People who use APIs are typically programmers. Okay? It's programmers who are writing a product that integrates with another product. From a programmer's perspective, doesn't this look more programmy than this? This kind of feels like a C-based language type of syntax, right? This is our cup of tea if you're a programmer. This is more like a dumb web developer's cup of tea. So somebody who's listening to the video doesn't get the context that I just stared at dumb web developer in the front row. But I do mean it sincerely, Dane.
No problem. I admit it.
I would argue it's not easy. I would much rather work with something like this than something like this. From a programming perspective. I would much rather write something to parse this than to parse this. What do you do with this? Ignore the opening and closing curly braces and just split everything else on semicolons? Done. Now, there's something we didn't show here. There's actually a syntax to store arrays in JSON, which allows it to become more powerful. So, for instance, let's just say that we had, I don't know, something called vals. Now, let's say vals is actually an array of well, the simple version of it would be val1, comma val2, comma val3. That would be the simple version of a 3-bucket array. But keep in mind that that's just storing strings, which is the default. What if you were storing roles? If you were storing roles, now you could have each bucket of that guy be a name, role 5, let's say, semicolon, description, German. I'm just going to duplicate that 3 times and just change the name of my role. Okay, so there's an example of it being JSON being used to store an array of objects. Now, you can actually make this look fairly structured. Let's just say that lines up. Whatever. It's close enough. So, do you see how that array is actually fairly structured looking when you space it right? Okay, so that's how you can represent objects where each of these is an actual object. It's a name description pair. Make sense? So kind of an interesting thing you can do with JSON that represents things in a more minimalistic manner for programmers' eyes. This is probably more readable for the average Joe's eyes. You know, lots of less thans and greater thans, but it's pretty descriptive what you're dealing with, right? Okay, so that's the difference between the different languages that we would see out there today. Now, the question is why do most APIs, if you have a place like Amazon who's creating an API to integrate with their product, why would they write their API in XML or JSON rather than coming up with something along these lines that might make sense for the problem they're solving? Is this most bestest?
The other ones are standard.
We are creating a private API. That is an API, we are the developers and we're creating a connection with our own tool to connect the app to the cloud. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's a great reason not to use a standard. But for the small problem we're storing right now, it's okay if we don't use a standard because it's for our eyes only. That makes sense? But public APIs, that is Dropbox or Amazon, all these different companies that have APIs, they need, I mean, when it's a public API, it's the people who wrote that product creating an API for everybody else. And everybody else needs to be able to interface with it. Does that make sense? So that's why they pick one of these two standards, because the idea is that if you're a developer, you should be familiar with these two guys. If you're a good developer, you should be able to write your own parser for either of these two guys. But if you're a smart developer, you would probably use a parser that's already created. Why reinvent the wheel? Make sense? XML, this guy, is not difficult to parse. It's just obnoxious to parse. See what I'm saying? It's one of those things you write once and don't worry about it again. Most of the parsers for XML are actually based on events dealing with saw the beginning of a tag, saw the ending of a tag, saw the beginning of a tag, saw the ending of a tag. Everything's about responding to those events so you can switch between which tag you're building, which tag you're not building, that kind of stuff. JSON parsers actually work significantly easier. It's a nested collection of objects and arrays. So what is this guy? This guy is a JSON object which contains three pieces of information. A value, and a JSON array, where that JSON array contains three pieces of information. A JSON object, and a JSON object. Kind of make sense? So they're defined in terms of themselves. So this is let's call it a pseudocode representation of what this guy says. It's an object containing three things, a standard value, and an array, and that array contains three elements. Each element is a JSON object. The simple array we had before that would have been a value, and a value, when we just had three strings. So the basic value in JSON is a string. Beyond that, we have objects, so objects are surrounded by the curly braces, arrays are surrounded by the square brackets. That's the whole JSON language. Just taught it to you. Now you can represent any data you want in JSON. Make sense? So, punchline is I just taught a group of programmers the entire JSON language in 30 seconds. So, if somebody's creating a public API and they're using JSON, they're now talking to a community of people who are in the know. Rather than having to go and create some sort of documentation that says, okay, look, we were drinking heavily. We decided to delimit all of our stuff by this. Now, truth be told, Dane had a little too much. He fell, hit the keyboard with his face, then his knee. We added the winky face at the end. But this is what we came up with. Does that make sense? So if you were writing a public API doing stuff like this, which is how it used to work, then every single time you need to go and use an API, you're going to have, well, when you go to give your API to somebody, you're going to have to give them the secret key. This is how you use it. Here's the crazy stuff you need that you're going to be dealing with here, rather than there being a standard. Okay. So this is the most bestest way of dealing with it. It's an inside joke, Dave. Most bestest, and you have more better, you have most bestest. And Dane likes pictures. Okay, so questions about that? Now, if we're building our own version of this guy, back to here, so we're using our ghetto way of representing roles, no big deal. So when we have our app use our API without a web page. That is, what does our app do? It reads in the name and the role name and the role description. It reads it in from this screen right here. We get these two pieces of information. When we hit save, what it does is it builds a URL that looks like this. So here's the website where it lives. Here's the name of the PHP file we're sending it to. Or if it's ASP.NET, it would be the ASPX page. But PHP is probably the common way of doing this. You can write the PHP script to process this and store it in a database in probably less than 10 lines of code. And after you write it once, it's just rinse, lather, repeat for every additional thing. You're going to pass in these two pieces of information in there. Now, the way you know that this is a GET request as opposed to a POST. Hello. Did I get a second one? No. Doesn't matter. Oh, I hate you. All right, here we go. The post version of this would look like this. Well, look, just like that, exactly. Post version of that. Is it gonna do it? Okay. Would look like that. Because now we're talking the HTTP protocol. So the HTTP protocol, HTTP is Hypertext Transport Protocol. That is, how do we send HTTP information between one point and another point? One of the things that we have to express to them is the method by which we're sending it. So we could say we're going to send it as a GET. We can say we're going to send it as a POST. If it's a POST, here's the destination, and then it has us build up the POST data, the individual variables, as part of the frame that's behind the scenes. So we can't represent a POST string in a URL. We can't build a special string like this. We can still pull it off programmatically. We can write it. But the simple way of doing it is to build your build a GET string like this. So this is what I would refer to as a GET string, where we are building something that we could paste into our web browser and have it arrive or have it get processed by something like saveRole.php. And as long as saveRole.php is looking for parameters from the GET parameters instead of the POST parameters, it will be able to retrieve name is equal to role4 and description is equal to blah. It will be able to get those things. That makes sense? So this is how we would write this if we were doing it ourselves. Now, it seems maybe pretty complex, but no, there's like 5 moving parts, but each part's pretty simple. But what we're going to do, and we'll look at this next time, is there is a tool that somebody showed me today. It's from a company called parse.com. And it allows you to do this type of stuff for free and automatically. So we'll be dealing with it sort of like we're dealing with NS user defaults. We'll save stuff in that similar way, except it won't save locally, it'll save in the cloud. Now, I say free, but the reality is, just to give you the punchline real quick, it's free when you are developing it. and you get up to like 1 million hits or something like that per month, 1 million push notifications, that kind of stuff. But then after that, you start paying them $200 a month. And if you go beyond that, you have an enterprise one. So realistically speaking, if you have 500 users using your app, and each one of those is doing 1,000 requests to get roles per month, you're going to go over your million pretty quick. For our purposes, this will work fine. Okay? So we'll come back. We'll work on this on Wednesday.